Margaret Whitfield thought she was calling 911 about a simple fence violation. She had no idea the man she was targeting was a federal agent whose illegal fence was actually a classified security perimeter installed by Homeland Security. When the police arrived, they weren't there to arrest him, they were there to protect something far more. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of Willowbrook Estates, but Margaret Whitfield wasn't admiring the view. She stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug trembling in her manicured hands, staring at the monstrosity that had appeared overnight in her neighbor's backyard. "Richard," she called to her husband, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Richard, get in here this instant." The fence was wrong. Everything about it screamed violation, not just of HOA regulations, but of the very fabric of their carefully curated community. 8 feet of black steel mesh topped with razor wire, industrial-grade posts anchored in concrete, and what appeared to be some kind of electronic monitoring system built into the framework. Richard shuffled into the kitchen, newspaper in hand. Reading glasses perched on his nose. "What's got you so worked up, Margaret? Look at that fortress that man has built." She jabbed her finger toward the window. "In the 3 years we've lived here, I've never seen anything so outrageous. The nerve." Richard squinted through the glass. "Well, it's certainly not standard suburban fencing." "Standard? Richard, it's a war zone. This is a family neighborhood, not some government compound." Margaret's voice rose to a pitch that made their poodle, Princess, whimper and retreat to the living room. The neighbor in question was David Chen, a quiet man in his early 40s who'd moved in 6 months ago. He kept to himself, maintained his lawn impeccably, and had never caused so much as a whisper of complaint. Until now. Margaret had tried to be neighborly at first. She'd brought him a welcome casserole and attempted to extract the usual suburban intelligence, occupation, family status, weekend hobbies. But David had been politely evasive, accepting the casserole with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and offering only that he worked in security. Security for what, she'd pressed, but he'd simply thanked her again and closed the door. Now, staring at the intimidating fence, Margaret felt vindicated in her suspicions. Normal people didn't need fortifications like this. Normal people didn't install what looked like military-grade surveillance equipment in their backyards. "I'm calling the HOA," she announced, already reaching for her phone. "Margaret, maybe we should know maybe about it, Richard. This is exactly why we have homeowner association rules. To prevent people like him from turning our neighborhood into some kind of compound." She dialed the HOA office with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it many times before. Margaret Whitfield was not just a resident of Willowbrook Estates, she was its self-appointed guardian, the woman who'd reported 17 violations in the past year alone. Mailboxes the wrong color, lawn decorations exceeding the size limit, garage doors left open past the permitted hours. Willowbrook Estates Community Association, this is Jennifer. Jennifer, this is Margaret Whitfield at 1247 Maple Drive. I need to report a severe violation by the resident at 1251 Maple Drive. What type of violation, Mrs. Whitfield? An authorized fence installation. This isn't just a violation, Jennifer, it's a complete disregard for our community standards. The fence is 8 feet tall, has barbed wire, and looks like something you'd see around a prison. Jennifer's typing was audible through the phone. "I see. We'll need to send someone out to assess the situation. Can you provide more details about the fence?" Margaret launched into a detailed description, her voice growing more agitated with each word. "The posts are metal, industrial-looking. There are cameras mounted on the corners, cameras, Jennifer. And some kind of electronic equipment that hums. It's disturbing the peace of our entire neighborhood. We'll have someone out there this afternoon, Mrs. Whitfield. In the meantime, I'd recommend not approaching the property or confronting the resident directly." "Oh, I have no intention of speaking to him. After what I've seen, I'm not sure he's the type of person we want in our community at all." Margaret hung up with a satisfied smile, but her victory felt hollow. The HOA was notoriously slow to act, and she'd watched enough news to know that dangerous people often hid behind quiet facades. What if David Chen was involved in something illegal? What if those cameras were monitoring her house? What if the fence was designed to keep people out or keep something in? Her imagination spiraled as she continued staring at the fence. She'd read about drug dealers who turned suburban homes into fortresses, about criminals who used quiet neighborhoods as cover for their operations. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that David Chen was hiding something sinister. By noon, Margaret had worked herself into a state of near panic. She'd called 3 neighbors, each conversation adding fuel to her growing paranoia. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned seeing official-looking vehicles at David's house late at night. Mr. Torres had noted that David's lawn was too perfect, as if he was trying to avoid drawing attention. Even Richard had admitted that something about their neighbor seemed off. "That's it," Margaret announced, pacing the kitchen. "I'm calling the police." "Margaret, don't you think that's a bit extreme? Maybe we should wait for the HOA." "Richard, what if he's dangerous? What if he's planning something? We have a responsibility to our community, to our neighbors. I won't have blood on my hands because I failed to act." She dialed 911 with shaking fingers. 911, what's your emergency? This is Margaret Whitfield at 1247 Maple Drive in Willowbrook Estates. I need to report suspicious activity by my neighbor. What type of suspicious activity? He's built an unauthorized fence around his property, 8 feet tall with barbed wire and surveillance equipment. This is a family neighborhood, and I'm concerned about the safety of our children. Fence violations are typically a civil matter. Is there an immediate danger? Margaret felt her frustration boiling over. "Officer, you don't understand. This isn't just a fence violation. This man has turned his property into some kind of compound. Normal people don't need prison-grade security in a suburban neighborhood. I'm genuinely concerned that he might be involved in illegal activities." There was a pause on the line. "Can you describe the fence and any other suspicious activity you've observed?" Margaret launched into her most dramatic account yet, describing the fence as military-grade fortification and David as secretive and evasive. She mentioned the late-night vehicles, the too-perfect lawn, and a growing conviction that something criminal was happening next door. "We'll send an officer out to assess the situation. Please stay inside and don't approach the property." "Thank you, officer. I'll be watching for your arrival." Margaret hung up and returned to her post at the kitchen window. She felt a mixture of satisfaction and anxiety, satisfaction that she'd finally taken action, anxiety about what the police might discover. Richard had retreated to his home office, muttering about unnecessary drama, but Margaret knew she was doing the right thing. The police car arrived 45 minutes later, a standard black and white unit with 2 officers inside. Margaret watched from her window as they parked in front of David's house and approached the front door. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see David answer the door, speak briefly with the officers, and then gesture toward his backyard. What happened next made Margaret's blood run cold. Instead of examining the fence or questioning David about violations, the officers began speaking rapidly into their radios. Their body language shifted from casual inquiry to urgent communication. One officer remained at the front door while the other jogged back to the patrol car, speaking animatedly into his radio. Within minutes, 2 unmarked black SUVs arrived, followed by a van with no visible markings. Men in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, moving with the precise efficiency of federal agents. Margaret watched in horror as they cordoned off the area around David's house, not to arrest him, but to establish a perimeter. "Richard," she called, her voice now genuinely frightened. "Richard, get in here. Something's wrong." Her husband appeared at her shoulder just as a woman in a sharp business suit approached their front door. The doorbell rang, but Margaret couldn't move. She stood frozen at the window, watching more vehicles arrive, watching agents take positions around the neighborhood, watching her quiet suburban street transform into what looked like a federal crime scene. The doorbell rang again. "Mrs. Whitfield." A voice called from outside. "This is Agent Sarah Martinez with the Department of Homeland Security. We need to speak with you about your 911 call." Margaret's coffee mug slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. Homeland Security. Not local police responding to a fence violation, but federal agents. Which meant David Chen wasn't just a neighbor with poor judgment about property modifications. He was something much more dangerous. And Margaret Whitfield had just called 911 on him. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the front door to find Agent Sarah Martinez standing on her pristine welcome mat. The woman was in her mid-30s, professionally dressed in a charcoal suit, with the kind of controlled demeanor that suggested she'd delivered bad news before. "Mrs. Whitfield, may we come in? We need to discuss your emergency call this morning." Behind Agent Martinez stood a tall man in his 50s, his silver hair perfectly styled, his eyes scanning the neighborhood with the practiced vigilance of someone trained to spot threats. He didn't introduce himself, but the way he positioned himself slightly behind and to the left of Martinez suggested he was her superior. Yes, of course." Margaret stepped aside, her voice barely above a whisper. "Richard, come here. Now." Richard appeared in the hallway, his face pale as he took in the sight of federal agents in their living room. Princess, sensing the tension, began barking from the kitchen until Richard scooped her up, holding the trembling dog like a shield. Agent Martinez settled into the armchair across from the sofa, her movements deliberate and controlled. The unnamed man remained standing, his attention split between watching the street through the front window and studying Margaret's face. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm Agent Martinez with the Department of Homeland Security. This is Deputy Director Harrison. We understand you called 911 this morning regarding your neighbor, David Chen." "Yes, I did." Margaret's voice cracked. "The fence, it's a violation of our HOA regulations." "I was concerned about, Mrs. Whitfield." Agent Martinez's tone was gentle but firm. "We need you to understand that Mr. Chen's property modifications are not HOA violations. They are authorized federal security installations." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Margaret's grandmother clock and Princess's nervous panting. Richard slowly lowered himself onto the sofa beside his wife, still clutching the dog. "Federal security installations," Margaret repeated, her voice hollow. "What does that mean?" Deputy Director Harrison finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of classified authority. "It means, Mrs. Whitfield, that your neighbor is a federal agent working on a case of national security importance. The fence you reported is a specialized containment system installed by our technical division." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "Containment system? What are you containing?" Agent Martinez leaned forward slightly. "That information is classified. What I can tell you is that Mr. Chen's assignment requires certain security protocols that may seem unusual to civilian neighbors. Your call this morning activated emergency procedures that put multiple agencies on high alert." "We didn't know," Richard said quietly. "We had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Harrison replied. "That's by design. However, Mrs. Whitfield, we need to discuss your extensive interest in Mr. Chen's activities." Margaret's stomach lurched. "Extensive interest?" Agent Martinez consulted a tablet. "Over the past 6 months, you've contacted the HOA office 14 times regarding Mr. Chen's property. You've questioned neighbors about his schedule, his visitors, and his activities. You've photographed his house from your window and maintained what appears to be a surveillance log." "I keep a neighborhood watch log," Margaret said defensively. "It's for security purposes." "Mrs. Whitfield," Harrison's voice carried a warning edge. "From a federal perspective, your behavior toward Agent Chen constitutes surveillance of a federal operative. That's a serious concern." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "I was just being a good neighbor. I was protecting our community by monitoring a federal agent." Agent Martinez's eyebrows rose. "Mrs. Whitfield, we need to understand why you've been so focused on Mr. Chen specifically. Have you been approached by anyone asking questions about him? Has anyone offered to pay you for information about his activities?" "No." Margaret's voice rose to a near shriek. "I'm not a spy. I'm a retired librarian. I just wanted to maintain neighborhood standards." Princess began barking again, feeding off Margaret's distress. Richard tried to calm both his wife and the dog, but his own fear was evident in his shaking hands. Mrs. Whitfield, please understand our position, Agent Martinez said, her tone professional but not unkind. We have a federal agent working a classified case. His security has been compromised by civilian interference. We need to determine if that interference was intentional or accidental. It was accidental, Margaret protested. I had no idea he was a federal agent. Then why the excessive interest in his activities? Harrison pressed. Why the detailed documentation? Why the campaign to have him removed from the neighborhood? Margaret stared at them, her mind racing. How could she explain that she'd been driven by a mixture of curiosity, social control, and growing paranoia? How could she make them understand that her behavior had been rooted in suburban politics, not espionage? Oh. I thought he was suspicious, she admitted finally. He was so secretive. He wouldn't talk about his work. He had strange hours, official-looking vehicles visiting late at night. I thought he might be involved in something illegal. Something illegal, Agent Martinez repeated. Such as? I don't know. Drugs, maybe. Or terrorism. I watch the news. I know that dangerous people hide in plain sight. I thought I was protecting my neighbors. Harrison and Martinez exchanged a look that Margaret couldn't interpret. It lasted only seconds, but in that brief moment, she glimpsed the complex calculations happening behind their professional facades. Mrs. Whitfield, Agent Martinez said finally, Mr. Chen is not involved in anything illegal. He's working to prevent something illegal. Something that, if successful, could harm thousands of innocent people. What kind of something? Richard asked, his voice barely audible. The kind that requires containment systems, Harrison replied grimly. The kind that requires we know exactly who's watching our agents and why. Margaret felt her world tilting. Are you saying, is there something dangerous in his house? We are saying that your interference has compromised a federal operation, Agent Martinez said. Your 911 call this morning triggered security protocols that may have alerted the very people we are trying to apprehend. The implications hit Margaret like a freight train. Her righteous indignation, her neighborhood watch vigilance, her campaign to maintain community standards, all of it had potentially sabotaged a federal investigation. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't know. I was just trying to do the right thing. Mrs. Whitfield, Harrison said, his voice taking on a different tone. We need your help now. My help? Your surveillance of Mr. Chen, while problematic, may have captured information we need. We need to review your neighborhood watch logs, your photographs, any documentation you've maintained about his property and activities. Margaret's mind reeled. You want to see my logs? We want to see everything, Agent Martinez said. Every photo, every note, every observation. It's possible you've documented something that could help us understand how our security was compromised. Richard spoke up. What happens if we refuse? Harrison's expression hardened. Mr. Whitfield, your wife has been conducting surveillance on a federal agent involved in a national security operation. Cooperation isn't really optional at this point. Margaret rose on unsteady legs. I'll get the files. As she walked toward her home office, Margaret's thoughts churned. Her careful documentation, her detailed observations, her photographic evidence, all of it was about to be scrutinized by federal agents. Every petty complaint, every suspicious notation, every moment of suburban paranoia would be examined through the lens of national security. She returned with a manila folder thick with printed pages and a small stack of photographs. Her hands trembled as she set them on the coffee table. Agent Martinez began flipping through the pages, her expression growing increasingly grave. Mrs. Whitfield, some of these observations are quite detailed. Times, dates, license plate numbers, descriptions of visitors. I wanted to be thorough. Margaret said weakly. Too thorough, Harrison muttered, studying one of the photographs. This shot shows the interior of his garage. How did you obtain this? Margaret's face flushed. When he left his garage door open, I took a picture. I thought it might be relevant to HOA regulations about storage. Mrs. Whitfield, Agent Martinez said slowly, this photograph shows classified equipment. The room fell silent again. Margaret stared at the photograph in Agent Martinez's hands, seeing it now through different eyes. What she'd thought was suspicious clutter was actually federal hardware. What she documented as HOA violations were national security assets. "Oh God," she whispered. "What have I done?" Agent Martinez closed the folder and looked directly at Margaret. "Mrs. Whitfield, you've created a security nightmare. These documents, these photographs, they contain enough information to compromise our entire operation. If the wrong people had access to this." "But they don't," Richard said quickly. "Margaret keeps everything locked in her filing cabinet. She's very organized." "Mr. Whitfield," Harrison said grimly, "someone broke into your house last night." Margaret's world stopped. "What?" "While you were asleep, someone entered your home. They were looking for exactly this kind of documentation. They were looking for intelligence about our operation." Margaret's legs gave out. She collapsed back onto the sofa, staring at the agents in horror. "So?" Margaret's fingers trembled as she logged into her cloud storage account on Agent Martinez's tablet. The familiar interface that had once represented her organizational pride now felt like a weapon pointed at her heart. Username, MWhitfield47. She typed, her voice barely audible. Password, Princess 2019. Agent Martinez's expression remained neutral, but Margaret caught the subtle eye roll. Even in her terror, she felt embarrassed by her pedestrian password choice. "How long have you been backing up files to this account?" Deputy Director Harrison asked, positioning himself behind Margaret's shoulder to watch the screen. 3 years. I back up everything, photos, documents, household records. I'm very careful about organization." "Too careful," Harrison muttered. The cloud storage dashboard loaded, revealing folders labeled with Margaret's obsessive precision: Neighborhood Watch 2024, HOA violations, suspicious activities, and most damning of all, 1251, Maple Drive, David Chen. Agent Martinez clicked on the Chen folder, and Margaret watched in horror as 6 months of surveillance unfolded on the screen. Dozens of photographs, detailed time logs, visitor documentation, and behavioral observations. All of it meticulously catalogued, all of it potentially accessible to anyone who might have compromised her account. "Mrs. Whitfield," Agent Martinez said slowly, "this folder has been accessed 17 times in the past 48 hours. The access logs show IP addresses from locations in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and South America." Margaret's vision blurred. "That's impossible. I'm the only one with the password." "Your password is your dog's name followed by the year she was born," Harrison said dryly. "It would take a competent hacker approximately 4 minutes to crack it. We need to assume everything in this account has been compromised," Agent Martinez said, scrolling through the files. "Mrs. Whitfield, you've essentially created a surveillance dossier on a federal agent and made it available to hostile foreign actors." Richard stood up abruptly, his face pale. "What does that mean for us? Are we in danger?" Before either agent could answer, Agent Martinez's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her professional composure cracked slightly. "Harrison. We have a problem." She answered the call, speaking in rapid, coded language that Margaret couldn't follow. But the tone was unmistakable, something was going very wrong. "Yes, sir. The civilian files are compromised. Multiple foreign access points. We need to accelerate the timeline." She paused, listening. "Understood. We'll implement containment protocols immediately." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What's happening?" Agent Martinez ended the call and turned to face them. "Mrs. Whitfield, because of your documentation, hostile actors now know the exact location of our operation. They know our agent's cover identity, his daily routines, and the security measures we've put in place." "They know about the fence?" Margaret asked weakly. "They know about everything," Harrison said grimly. "Your files contain detailed photographs of our containment system, including angles that show vulnerable entry points. You've essentially provided a blueprint for attacking a federal facility. Margaret sank deeper into the sofa cushions. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. You were protecting it, Agent Martinez said, her voice carrying an unexpected note of sympathy. From the wrong threat. What do you mean? Agent Martinez looked at Harrison, who nodded slightly. Mrs. Whitfield, Agent Chen isn't just investigating a crime. He's protecting your neighborhood from a biological weapon. The words hit Margaret. Like a physical blow. A what? 3 weeks ago, a terrorist cell acquired a weaponized strain of anthrax. Intelligence indicated they were planning to test it in a suburban environment, specifically a neighborhood that matches Willowbrook Estate's demographics. Richard's voice was barely a whisper. They were going to test it here. Agent Chen's assignment was to intercept them before they could deploy the weapon. The fence you reported is actually a specialized containment system designed to neutralize biological agents. Your neighbor's house has been converted into a temporary biocontainment facility. Margaret stared at them in horror. There's anthrax. In David's house. There was going to be, Harrison corrected. The plan was to intercept the terrorists when they arrived to deploy the weapon. We had intelligence suggesting they would make contact with local residents to gather information about the neighborhood. The implication hit Margaret like a sledgehammer. The person who broke into our house was likely a terrorist operative looking for exactly the kind of detailed neighborhood intelligence you've been collecting, Agent Martinez confirmed. Your surveillance logs would have told them everything they needed to know about the target area. Margaret felt sick. I helped them. Unknowingly, Harrison said. But yes. Your files have given them a tactical advantage we hadn't anticipated. Agent Martinez's phone buzzed again. This time she didn't bother with coded language. They've moved up the timeline. ETA 30 minutes. Margaret's heart stopped. What does that mean? It means the terrorists are coming now. Today. And thanks to your files, they know exactly what they are walking into. Through the front window, Margaret could see the activity level around David's house intensifying. More unmarked vehicles were arriving, and agents in tactical gear were taking positions around the perimeter. The quiet suburban street was transforming into a war zone. We need to evacuate you immediately, Agent Martinez said, standing up. Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Whitfield, gather only essential items. We are moving you to a secure location. What about our neighbors? Richard asked. What about the other families on the street? They are being evacuated as we speak, Harrison replied. Under the pretext of a gas leak emergency. We can't risk civilian casualties. Margaret rose on shaking legs. This is all my fault. Mrs. Whitfield, Agent Martinez said, her voice firm but not unkind, you made a mistake. A serious one. But dwelling on it now won't help anyone. We need to focus on damage control. As they gathered their belongings, Margaret caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back looked older, more fragile, stripped of the righteous confidence that had driven her to spy on her neighbors. Her carefully constructed world of HOA regulations and neighborhood standards had collided with the reality of international terrorism, and she was responsible for the carnage. Agent Martinez, she said quietly, is there anything I can do to help? The agent paused in her radio communication. What do you mean? I know things about the neighborhood that might not be in official records. I've been watching everyone, documenting everything. If that information could help protect people. Harrison looked at her with new interest. What kind of information? Escape routes, hiding places, patterns of behavior. I know which houses have basement-safe rooms, which families have children, which properties have security systems. I know this neighborhood better than anyone. Agent Martinez exchanged a look with Harrison. Mrs. Whitfield, are you volunteering to assist in a federal counterterrorism operation? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret thought about her neighbors, the families with young children, the elderly couples, the hard-working people who'd done nothing wrong except live next door to a woman whose obsession with control had attracted the attention of killers. Yes, she said firmly. I am. Harrison said, these are extremely dangerous people. If they discover you're helping us. They already know who I am, Margaret replied. They broke into my house. They accessed my files. I'm already a target. Agent Martinez nodded slowly. What do you need from us? Access to the neighborhood surveillance system. I helped design the Community Watch program. I know where all the cameras are located, which ones are dummy units, and which ones actually record. I can help you track their movements. And if they try to use civilians as hostages. Margaret's jaw tightened. Then they'll have to deal with someone who knows every hiding place, every basement, every potential escape route in this neighborhood. Someone who's been watching everyone and everything for 3 years. For the first time since the agents had arrived, Margaret felt a spark of her old determination. But this time, instead of being driven by petty neighborhood politics, she was motivated by something far more important, the need to protect her community from a threat she'd inadvertently helped create. Mrs. Whitfield, Agent Martinez said, if you're going to help us, you need to understand that this isn't a neighborhood watch meeting. These people will kill you without hesitation if they discover what you're doing. Margaret looked out the window at the tactical teams taking position around David's house, then at the families being quietly evacuated under the pretense of a gas leak emergency. Her obsessive documentation had created this crisis, but it might also be the key to resolving it. Agent Martinez, she said, I've spent 3 years learning everything about this neighborhood. It's time I put that knowledge to good use. Harrison smiled grimly. Mrs. Whitfield, welcome to the counter-terrorism business. But as they prepared to leave for the command center, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her decision to help had just painted an even bigger target on her back. The terrorists weren't just coming for Agent Chen anymore, they were coming for her, and they knew exactly where to fire. The mobile command center was a converted RV parked 3 blocks away from Willowbrook Estates, its exterior designed to look like a cable repair vehicle. Inside, banks of monitors displayed feeds from every security camera in the neighborhood. Thermal imaging from overhead drones and tactical positions of federal agents. Margaret sat at a cramped workstation, her hands moving across a keyboard with surprising efficiency as she pulled up the neighborhood surveillance network she'd helped design. 3 years of obsessive documentation had given her an intimate knowledge of every camera angle, every blind spot, every potential approach route. Camera 7 is positioned to monitor the cul-de-sac, she explained to Agent Martinez, who was studying the feeds intently. But it has a dead zone near the storm drain. If they approach from the east, they could avoid detection until they are within 50 feet of David's house. What about camera 12? Harrison asked, pointing to a feed showing the back entrance to the development. That's actually a dummy unit, Margaret replied. The HOA installed it to deter teenage vandalism, but it's not connected to the recording system. We have a real camera hidden in the oak tree about 20 feet to the left. Agent Martinez made notes on her tablet. Mrs. Whitfield, this intelligence is invaluable. You've essentially mapped out the entire neighborhood's security infrastructure. Margaret felt a complex mixture of pride and guilt. Her compulsive need to monitor her neighbors was finally proving useful, but the circumstances that had made it necessary filled her with shame. Agent Martinez called a technician from across the command center. We've got movement on the perimeter. 3 vehicles approaching from different directions. Margaret's blood ran cold as she watched the monitors. 3 black SUVs were converging on Willowbrook Estates, their occupants invisible behind tinted windows. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military operation, spacing themselves to cover multiple escape routes. They're using the approach pattern I documented, Margaret whispered, recognizing the tactical formation from her own surveillance notes. They know exactly how to avoid the main security cameras. Because they read your files, Harrison said grimly. They are using your own intelligence against us. On the monitors, Margaret watched the SUVs take positions around the neighborhood perimeter. The lead vehicle stopped near the main entrance, while the other 2 moved to cover the service road and the emergency exit near the park. They weren't just planning to attack, they were planning to ensure no one could escape. Agent Martinez, another technician, called out, "We're detecting electronic jamming equipment." They are trying to disrupt our communications. Margaret's mind raced. The jamming won't affect the hardwired security system. Those cables run underground, they can't be disrupted remotely. Can you access the system from here? Agent Martinez asked. Yes, but... Margaret hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. If I log in, they'll be able to trace the access point. They'll know exactly where we are. Harrison looked at her with new respect. Mrs. Whitfield, that's a sophisticated understanding of digital security. I may be a retired librarian, but I'm not stupid, Margaret replied. I've been running a neighborhood surveillance network for 3 years. I know how to protect sensitive information. Agent Martinez's radio crackled with urgent chatter. Command, this is Overwatch. We have eyes on the primary target. The subjects are moving toward the Chen residence. Margaret watched the monitors as figures in tactical gear emerged from the SUVs. They moved with military precision, but something about their formation seemed off to a trained eye. Agent Martinez, she said urgently, they are not moving like terrorists. What do you mean? I've watched hundreds of hours of security footage. I know how different groups move through the neighborhood. These people are moving like law enforcement. Harrison frowned. Are you suggesting they are not terrorists? I'm suggesting they are trained professionals. Look at their formation, they are using standard tactical approaches, not guerrilla warfare patterns. On the screen, the figures were approaching David's house with textbook precision. They weren't charging in like zealots, they were moving like a coordinated strike team. Agent Martinez, the radio crackled again, we're detecting additional movement. Someone's approaching the command center. Margaret's heart stopped. Through the RV small window, she could see a figure in dark clothing moving between the parked cars on the street. They weren't random, they were specifically targeting the command center. They know we're here, she whispered. How is that possible? Agent Martinez demanded. Margaret's mind raced through the possibilities. The hardwired security system. If they are as skilled as you think they are, they could have traced the network access point. You said the system couldn't be compromised. I said it couldn't be jammed, Margaret corrected. But if they have physical access to the network infrastructure. Harrison was already moving toward the RV's rear exit. We need to evacuate. Now. Wait, Margaret said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. I can lock down the entire system. If they are using the security network to track us, I can turn it against them. Mrs. Whitfield, there's no time, there is if you trust me, Margaret interrupted. I designed this system. I know how to weaponize it. Agent Martinez looked at Harrison, who nodded grimly. Do it. Margaret's fingers moved across the keyboard with the confidence of someone who'd spent years perfecting her craft. She began activating dormant security protocols, turning motion sensors into tracking devices, converting camera feeds into real-time mapping systems. I'm creating a digital net, she explained as she worked. Every motion sensor, every camera, every electronic device in the neighborhood is now part of a coordinated surveillance system. They can't move without us knowing exactly where they are. On the monitors, the effect was immediate. Red dots appeared on the neighborhood map, showing the precise location of every intruder. Margaret had turned Willowbrook Estates into a giant tracking system. Impressive, Harrison said. But how does that help us? Because now I can do this, Margaret said, entering a final command sequence. Every electronic device in the neighborhood, garage doors, security alarms, sprinkler systems, even electronic doorbells, began activating simultaneously. The coordinated cacophony created a wall of sound and confusion that would mask the federal agents' movements while disorienting the intruders. Jesus, Agent Martinez breathed. You've turned the entire neighborhood into a weapon. I've turned it into a trap, Margaret corrected. But only if your people are ready to spring it. Harrison was already coordinating with the tactical teams. All units, the neighborhood is secure. Subjects are tagged and tracked. Execute containment protocols. Margaret watched the monitors as federal agents emerged from their concealed positions, moving with the precision of a choreographed dance. The intruders, confused by the electronic chaos and blinded by the surveillance net, were being systematically isolated and captured. Agent Martinez, she said quietly, there's something else. What? The lead vehicle. The one at the main entrance. It's not trying to escape. Agent Martinez looked at the monitor showing the SUV still parked near the neighborhood entrance. What do you mean? It's been sitting there for 10 minutes. No movement, no attempt to flee. Either the driver is dead, or they are waiting for something. Harrison joined them at the monitor. Waiting for what? Margaret's blood ran cold as the implications hit her. They are waiting for the real attack. What are you talking about? Agent Martinez, what if these aren't the terrorists? What if they are just a distraction? The command center fell silent except for the hum of electronic equipment. Margaret's words hung in the air like a death sentence. You're saying this is a decoy operation? Harrison asked. I'm saying I've been watching this neighborhood for 3 years and I've never seen a coordinated attack that left escape routes unguarded. These people are professionals, but they are not acting like people who expect to survive. Agent Martinez's radio suddenly crackled with urgent chatter. Command, this is Agent Chen. We have a problem. The biocontainment system is showing signs of external tampering. Someone's trying to breach the facility. Margaret felt the world tilt. They are not trying to steal the anthrax. They are trying to release it. What? Agent Martinez, if they wanted to deploy anthrax in the neighborhood, they wouldn't need to fight through your security. They just need to breach the containment system and let the wind do the rest. The horrifying truth crystallized in Margaret's mind. The tactical team wasn't there to steal biological weapons, they were there to create a diversion while a second team breached the biocontainment facility. Her surveillance network had captured the decoy operation, but the real attack was happening right under their noses. Agent Martinez, she said urgently, I need access to the industrial monitoring system. The one that tracks utilities and infrastructure. Why? Because if they are trying to breach the containment system, they'll need to access the buildings. Ventilation controls. And those are connected to the neighborhood's smart grid. Margaret's fingers flew across the keyboard, accessing systems she'd never needed to monitor before. Industrial sensors, HVAC controls, power distribution networks, all of it connected, all of it v. Agent Chen is pinned down inside the biocontainment facility, Agent Martinez said, her voice tight with urgency. The diversionary attack worked. While we were focused on the surface operation, they breached the underground systems. He can't reach us. Margaret stared at the biometric scanner, her mind racing through impossible calculations. The flooding system that could save the neighborhood required David Chen's authentication, but he was trapped in his house while terrorists tried to breach the containment system from below. How long before they break through, she asked. Harrison consulted his tablet. Engineering estimates 12 minutes before they can compromise the primary containment vessel. 12 minutes before weaponized anthrax would be released into the air above Willowbrook Estates. 12 minutes before her neighbors, the families she'd watched through her obsessive surveillance, would be exposed to a biological weapon that could kill thousands. There has to be another way, Margaret said, but even as she spoke, she knew there wasn't. The smart grid system had been designed with multiple failsafes to prevent unauthorized access. Only Agent Chen's biometric signature could authorize emergency protocols. Mrs. Whitfield, Agent Martinez said gently, you've done everything you could. This isn't your fault anymore. Yes, it is, Margaret replied, her voice steady with newfound resolve. And that means it's my responsibility to fix it. She stood up from the workstation, her movements deliberate and calm. I'm going to get Agent Chen. Absolutely not, Harrison said. Mrs. Whitfield, there are armed terrorists between here and that house. You're a civilian. I'm a civilian who knows every entrance, every hiding place, every possible route through that neighborhood. I'm also the only person here who isn't a federal agent. What does that mean? Margaret pulled up the surveillance feeds on her tablet, studying the positions of the diversionary team still engaged with federal agents on the surface. It means they don't know what I look like. To them, I'm just another neighbor. Agent Martinez shook her head. It's too dangerous. We can't ask you to. You're not asking, Margaret interrupted. I'm volunteering. Agent Martinez, I spent 3 years documenting every detail of David Chen's life. I know his daily routines, his security protocols, even his emergency procedures. If anyone can reach him, it's me. She began pulling up files on her tablet, showing them detailed floor plans of David's house that she'd constructed from months of observation. He has a safe room in the basement, reinforced walls, independent air supply. If he's following protocol, that's where he'll be. How could you possibly know that? Harrison asked. Margaret's face flushed slightly. I may have been more thorough in my surveillance than I initially admitted. I documented delivery schedules, construction permits, even utility upgrades. When someone installs a safe room in a suburban house, there are permits filed with the city. Agent Martinez stared at her. You accessed city records as part of your neighborhood watch. I accessed everything, Margaret admitted. Tax records, utility bills, construction permits, even property insurance claims. I wanted to know everything about everyone in my neighborhood. For the first time since this crisis began, Harrison smiled. Mrs. Whitfield, you might be the most qualified intelligence analyst I've ever met. I'm also the most motivated, she replied. Agent Martinez, I need tactical gear and a communication device. And I need you to coordinate the surface teams to give me a clear path to the house. Margaret, Richard spoke up from the corner where he'd been silently watching, you could be killed. She turned to face her husband, seeing the fear in his eyes but also something she hadn't seen in years, respect. Richard, 3 years ago I started watching our neighbors because I wanted to protect our community. I just never imagined it would come to this. Agent Martinez was already pulling equipment from a tactical case. Mrs. Whitfield, if you're going to do this, you need to understand the risks. These people have already killed to get this far. Then I'll just have to make sure they don't get the chance to kill anyone else, Margaret replied, accepting the communication earpiece and protective vest. She studied the surveillance feeds one more time, memorizing the positions of the diversionary team and the federal agents. Agent Martinez, I'll need exactly 4 minutes of coordinated distraction. Can your teams create enough noise to mask my approach? What kind of noise? Margaret smiled grimly. The kind that makes it sound like you're launching a full assault on the house. Draw their attention to the front while I approach from the rear. As she prepared to leave the command center, Margaret felt a strange sense of completion. For 3 years, she'd watched her neighbors from a distance, documenting their lives but never truly connecting with them. Now, the knowledge she'd gained through that obsessive surveillance was the only thing standing between them and disaster. Mrs. Whitfield, Agent Martinez said as Margaret reached the door, Agent Chen doesn't know you're coming. How will you convince him to trust you? Margaret paused, her hand on the door handle. Agent Martinez, I've been watching David Chen for 6 months. I know he takes his coffee black, reads the morning paper from back to front, and checks his perimeter security exactly every 2 hours. I know he's been trained to trust his instincts, and his instincts are going to tell him that a middle-aged librarian who knows his security protocols isn't a threat. And if you're wrong, then at least I'll die trying to save my neighbors instead of hiding in a command center. Margaret slipped out of the RV and into the pre-dawn darkness, moving through the familiar streets of her neighborhood with the confidence of someone who'd walked these routes hundreds of times. But now, instead of conducting surveillance, she was the one being hunted. She avoided the main streets, using the network of backyard paths and service alleys she'd mapped during her neighborhood watch activities. Every camera angle, every motion sensor, every potential hiding place, she knew them all. As she approached David's house, she could hear the sound of gunfire from the front of the property. Agent Martinez's teams were providing the distraction she'd requested, drawing the attention of the diversionary force away from the rear approach. Margaret reached the back fence, the same imposing barrier that had started this entire crisis. Up close, she could see details that her surveillance photos had missed, sophisticated sensors embedded in the mesh, nearly invisible tripwires, and what appeared to be automated defensive systems. She pulled out her tablet and accessed the security system she'd been monitoring for months. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency as she disabled the motion sensors and created a temporary gap in the electronic perimeter. Agent Chen, she whispered into her communication device, "This is Margaret Whitfield from 1247 Maple Drive. I'm coming to get you." The response crackled through her earpiece. "Mrs. Whitfield. How the hell are you? Never mind. The basement. Safe room. Code is your address numbers reversed." Margaret smiled despite the danger. Even in a crisis, David Chen was thinking like a federal agent, using information he knew she would have access to. She made her way to the basement entrance, entering the code 7421. The safe room door opened to reveal David Chen, still in his tactical gear but clearly relieved to see her. "Mrs. Whitfield, what are you doing here?" "I'm here to get you out so you can save the neighborhood," she replied. "We need your biometric authentication to activate the flood system." "The flood system? I'll explain on the way. Right now, we need to get you back to the command center in the next 8 minutes, or everyone in Willowbrook Estates is going to be exposed to weaponized anthrax." David stared at her for a moment, then smiled. "Mrs. Whitfield, has anyone ever told you that you're terrifying?" "Only when I need to be," she replied. "Now come on. I know a route that will get us there safely." As they prepared to leave the safe room, Margaret realized that her 3-year campaign of neighborhood surveillance had led to this moment, not the vindication of her suspicions about a dangerous neighbor, but the discovery that the most dangerous thing in Willowbrook Estates had always been her own obsessive need to control everything around her. The irony was perfect. Margaret Whitfield, who had spent years trying to eliminate threats to her community, had become the greatest threat of all. And now, the only way to save her neighbors was to use the very surveillance skills that had endangered them in the first place. "Agent Chen," she said as they moved toward the exit, "when this is over, I owe you an apology." "Mrs. Whitfield," he replied, checking his weapon, "when this is over, I'm recommending you for a commendation." But as they stepped out into the darkness, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that survival was far from guaranteed. The terrorists weren't finished yet, and she was about to discover that her surveillance of the neighborhood had missed the most important detail of all: she had never been the hunter. She had always been the prey.